Sam Stark is the CEO and founder, the co-founder and CEO of Green Project Technologies. Sam previously worked for Goldman Sachs in their energy and sustainability groups. So welcome, Sam. And we look forward to having you talk about ESG data. How is it being tracked in supply chains, and how PE firms really make use of this data?
Yeah, thank you very much. And to kick things off, I'll just give a little background about myself and Green Project, and then can kind of hop into kind of the work we're doing in supply chains and private equity. So just to give some background, before I was at Green Project, I was working at Goldman Sachs. We were really starting to look at the next phase of ESG data collection. And a lot of this was to do with our Scope 3 emissions in our supply chain. So we're trying to get a hold of all of our different suppliers and vendors' emissions, as well as our emissions from our merchant bank and our private investments. This is where investors and regulators were starting to want to look at. And this is where we thought we really wanted to try to get a handle on after we were starting to capture our operational emissions. And very quickly, as we started to talk and engage with suppliers, vendors, and our portfolio companies, we really didn't have a good way of capturing and tracking the data. Most of our suppliers and vendors didn't have a dedicated sustainability manager or ESG person in place. And so they really struggled to know what even Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are, let alone how to correctly track and report on those emissions. And so I really saw that there was a need to be able to automate the tracking and reporting of this data. And so we came about to create Green Project to really help automate track and reporting ESG data across supply chains and across private markets, particularly with private equity and venture capital. So I'm going to share my screen here, just have a little presentation to walk through and kind of touch on exactly kind of where we're seeing kind of the next phase of ESG data collection, moving more and more downstream to the private markets and to the supply chains. So as many of, has been touched on, and many of you have seen, there's been a lot of climate and ESG disclosures that are here to stay. Last Monday, as many of you know, the SEC put forth a proposal, which if enacted would force every public company in the US to disclose their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and every public company over 700 million in market cap to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 3 emissions also includes their supply chain. Now, this is monumental and is being enacted around the world, as there are similar movements and disclosures in Europe with SFDR reporting and globally with TCFD reporting. You also have private market frameworks coming out, such as the ESG Data Convergence Project, requiring private equity and venture capital firms to disclose the emissions of their investments. Although many of you are familiar with these different frameworks and these have been getting a lot of press, I want to focus here on how these regulatory and investor-led disclosures are causing actually downstream disclosure effects to supply chains and the private markets. In the coming pages, I'll walk through the specific implications of growing ESG reporting pressure for supply chain managers at large companies as they work to drive ESG data capture and reporting at suppliers and vendors, as well as private investment managers as they look to capture emissions and other ESG disclosures across their portfolio. The first thing I'll touch on is, looking at the SEC's proposal for every public company over 700 million in market cap, it will require Scope 3 emissions tracking and reporting. And this means for businesses to accurately track and report on their suppliers' emissions, which are included in Scope 3 emissions, they need to continue to work towards engaging their suppliers and vendors and having their suppliers and vendors themselves be measuring their emissions. Many of the large public companies we've talked to are already planning to implement different programs this year and next year to start requiring their suppliers and vendors to start recording this data, or they will potentially start dropping them if they do not. So this is becoming more and more of a compliance if you want to be a supplier and vendors to some of these larger corporations. As part of public companies engaging with their suppliers, they're having them to submit to CDP. It's a leading reporting framework that has over 8,000 suppliers reporting so far. As you can see, supply chain emissions are accounting for the vast majority of a business's emissions, and this is why it's so critical for companies to start accurately tracking and measuring their supply chain emissions. As of now, although there is around 8,000 suppliers submitting to CDP, this is only a small percentage of the overall supply chain universe, and thousands more are going to be required with these new reporting frameworks. Additionally, roughly 35% of the global 2,000 firms have a net zero supply chain commitment, which means that everything of one of their suppliers must not just be tracking and reporting on their emissions each year, but also must commit to net zero themselves. Although companies achieving their net zero targets will see incremental progress, with many organizations setting key reduction milestones for 2030 and 2050, suppliers and vendors must be mobilized immediately by their major purchasers to ensure the right controls and processes can be in place for these 2030 and 2050 deadlines. This pressure to disclose climate data is not just driven downstream with the supply chain and regulatory frameworks, but it's also driven from investors. You have the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, where there are over 230 signatories representing more than 50 trillion in assets under management, in addition to trillions more from UNPRI. And the increasing focus is not just on public companies who investors are putting capital on, but to private equity and private markets as well. This means private equity firms and their portfolio companies now have to consider climate disclosures and risk, which was once something that was only started to be thinking about for public companies. A perfect example of this in the private markets is the ESG Data Convergence Project, which has over a combined $12 trillion in assets under management from leading LPs that are starting to require their private equity GPs and venture capital GPs to start tracking and monitoring their portfolio company level ESG data. Yet the problem we're seeing from both the supply chain side as well as from the private equity side is that most of these companies not only are most of these companies needing to start to think about track and reporting scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data and other ESG data, but there's very little help that they have within their current organizations. They don't have the same capital or resources to undertake a full climate or ESG disclosure program. According to Goldman Sachs Investment Research, around 70% of S&P 500 companies are tracking their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Yet this number drops to less than 10% for Russell 2000 companies and is negligible for the private market. So right now, companies of the sizes of SMEs or private market companies, they don't have very useful tools to be able to really truly capture and report on these ESG and carbon emission disclosures, but they're getting pressure from all angles, whether from their larger clients, who are getting regulatory pressure, or from their investors themselves. Green Project's objective is to really help change this. We focus specifically on supply chain companies and on private investments. Our data collection process is automated through API integrations. Our dashboard is meant to be intuitive and simple to use, modeled off of QuickBooks. And our carbon management is meant to be accessible for anybody, regardless of if they have a background in sustainability. We've built our SaaS-based platform to be flexible and specifically cater to the needs of investment and supply chain managers. We've spoken with hundreds of private equity and venture capital firms, as well as B2B purchasers and a range of suppliers and vendors to learn what they need for an intuitive, frictionless experience. We now hope to meet these companies where they are on their ESG journey, providing simplified onboarding, data sharing, and reporting to assist teams with limited sustainability resources to create accessible insights and improvements. We're trying to build an ecosystem as well of carbon reduction solutions, including partnerships with top-tier consulting firms, energy efficiency providers, and vetted carbon offsets and renewable energy providers. And our objective is to make climate reporting accessible to everyone, not just the companies with the largest budgets or larger public companies. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions, but hope that was a kind of a good brief overview of the downstream effects of ESG disclosure.
That's great, Sam, and to see all these resources that you could be providing to companies, especially as ESG disclosures become increasingly important. We do have a question where it doesn't seem like there are existing frameworks for new companies or startups to grow in sustainability. GHG reduction goal frameworks like SBTs assume baseline reductions. Why can't we reward companies who bake in sustainability from the growth stage at the beginning?
Yeah, I think one of the best things to do, and SBTI does have, oh yeah, I think David mentioned it, just put this in the chat, but they do have intensity metrics that you can do. And I think this is kind of one of the best ways to look at this. Being able to reduce your carbon emission intensity. So on a per capita, so your tons of CO2 equivalents per employee or per dollar of revenue or per square foot in certain cases, can be really good metrics for companies who are really trying to grow. And obviously their carbon emission level is going to grow, but they want to improve kind of their overall efficiency and kind of grow sustainably. And so the more we can improve kind of those intensity or per capita metrics is, I think, the best place for companies who are early stage. I also just think it's a really good thing for startups or early stage companies to have these programs in place, because it's increasingly becoming important for fundraising from different GPs, whether in venture capital or private equity. And so even if aren't a net zero startup, you can still have the metrics to point towards your GPs. And so I think it's a really important thing.
Exactly. And if you could expand, how does your product really work?
Yeah, definitely. So we do a number of different API integrations. So pretty much, for instance, for Scope 2 emissions as an example, all you would have to put in is your utility credentials. So, if you're using Con Edison, let's say in New York for your electricity, you put in your username and password, and automatically we would be able to pull your kilowatt hour usage, your natural gas usage across all your different facilities. We have similar API integrations with ERP systems, financial accounting softwares, fleet management, travel management softwares. So we try to make the ease of data collection as simple as possible. And then we have a large emissions factor database that translates the different data points that you provide into the correct emissions categories broken down for in accordance with the GHG protocol. And for private equity firms or supply chain managers, we give you a rolled up view of your whole supply chain or your whole portfolio companies. So you can be able to download reports to send to LPs in the case of private equity, or to send to regulatory places in the case of supply chain managers.
That's excellent. I love the small business startup perspective that you add to this, because a lot of the conversation on sustainability funds has focused on how investors and where investors will invest, but not very much on the other side of the conversation. How can startups be more ESG investable? Or
exactly, really trying to make this accessible. Our onboarding experience usually takes around a week at most, and we can get a company up and running within a few hours by connecting to their system. So our objective is to be both comprehensive but also be accessible to really any company wherever they are on their kind of ESG journey. And yes, it's a subscription model, so you pay an annual license each year.
That's great. That's great. So if there are no more questions, this was a great presentation. Thanks.